Hello everyone, it's 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and that means it's time for another of our CoCoRaHS Weather Talk webinars. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Henry Regis. Behind the scenes today, running our technical side of the program, are Zach Schwalbe and Noah Newman. And hopefully joining me here shortly is my colleague, CoCoRaHS founder, Nolan Duskin. We're coming to you live from the Colorado Climate Center here at Colorado State University in what has turned out to be a frigid morning here at Fort Collins, Colorado. I had 11 below at my house, and some areas were even colder than that. Hey, for those of you who are unable to join us for our live broadcast, we'll be recording it for future viewing on our website. All of our Weather Talk webinars are sponsored by grants from NOAA's Office of Education and the National Science Foundation. Well, today's webinar will focus on climate change, ecology, and disease emergence, and we'll look at this from a public health perspective. And we're excited to have with us today the chief of the Bacterial Diseases Branch of the CDC, that's the Center for Disease Control's Division of Vector-Borne Diseases, Ben Beard. Ben coordinates the CDC's programs on Lyme disease, plague, and tularemia, I think I pronounced that correctly, and also coordinates the CDC's work in understanding and mitigating the potential impact of climate variability and change on infectious disease ecology. Ben's credentials include degrees from Auburn University, Louisiana State University School of Medicine, the University of Florida, and postdoctoral fellowship and research associate at Yale University School of Medicine. A lot of different credentials there. Ben and his family reside here in Fort Collins, Colorado. And Ben, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome. I'm sure you're excited, and congrats on Auburn's win over the Crimson Tide last weekend.
Yes, I guess I'd have to begin by just saying War Eagle, but besides that, thanks a lot, Henry, and I appreciate you and the other organizers inviting me to give this talk, which is perhaps a little ill-fated given the weather we've had today, to talk about climate change and global warming and the impact on infectious diseases. On a day as frigid as this, it's doubtful that there are a lot of diseases out there moving right this moment. But anyway, we'll go with that. Can you hear me okay?
We can, Ben, and thank you once again for being with us. We'll come back at the end of Ben's presentation. We'll take questions, and Ben, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So what I'd like to do today in the next 30 or 45 minutes is just to talk a little bit about what climate change projections are and some of the observations that we're seeing right now. We'll talk a little bit about climate-sensitive infectious diseases and conditions, what we're seeing in terms of incidence and trends. And then we'll talk about what I call a One Health paradigm, and this is a lens in which we look at infectious disease ecology through the view of animal health, human health, and the environment, and how climate changes in climate potentially impacts disease ecology. And we'll focus in particularly on one case study, which is Lyme disease, which is the area that we focus on most in the branch here in Fort Collins. And then I'll conclude by talking a little bit about a public health framework for addressing these issues as we move forward into the future. So, and as a disclaimer, I'm not a climatologist, and so I'm sure many people on the telephone today know more about climatology and weather and other issues like that than I do. But I rely primarily on sources such as this, the IPCC report, and this is a figure from the AR4, the 2007 report. AR5 has been completed and will be published publicly very soon. But from the AR4 report, by 2010, the global mean temperatures are expected to increase by somewhere between 2 and 11.5 degrees, according to different models. And there are a number of different models. On the top panel, you see a moderate greenhouse gas generated model and how we expect to see temperature impacted over the next 75 to 100 years. And then the lower panel shows a more aggressive greenhouse gas increase pattern. And just the point here is that we do expect to see temperatures increasing, and we expect to see to see it in an inconsistent way and across the globe, especially with greater impact seen in the polar regions. Similarly, we expect to see changes in precipitation patterns, and really what this map really just shows is really three things: that these patterns are different in different parts of the world, that they tend to be more attenuated in the polar regions, and then finally that there's a lot of still a lot of uncertainty in these models. But I think it is pretty safe to say that we expect to see, as an impact of global change, changes in both temperature and in precipitation. And so it's a little difficult sometimes to wrap our arms around climate change or global warming or you know, such a long and slow process. But what I tend to think of it in terms of how it impacts our work really is in climate variability and climate disruption. And so some of the anticipated trends, I think, are things such as longer, warmer summers, shorter and milder winters, increased frequency of severe and unpredictable weather events, such things as storms, heat waves, droughts, and we've certainly seen our share of this here in northern Colorado in the last couple of years with the fires that we've seen and the flood event that we had just a couple of months ago. And then also the idea of regional variation. And this is the idea that what goes on here in the West or in the Rocky Mountain regions, you know, may be quite different than what we expect to see in Florida or in Alaska or in the Pacific Northwest. So, but those are some of the things that we expect. And this map is taken from the originally from the U.S. Global Change Research Program report in 2010, but it's reproduced in American Public Health Association and CDC publication that was published in 2011. It really just shows some of the regional trends and expectations or anticipations from the various climate change models. And I won't go through all of this, but I would emphasize, you see the box that around Alaska down in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, and it mentions longer summers, higher temperatures, erratic weather patterns, increasing insect pests and wildfires, thawing permafrost, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's really interesting to note that for us in the lower 48, we talk about climate adaptation, climate change adaptation in a very futuristic way. But for our colleagues in Alaska, these are things they're dealing with right now. And if you look at glacier recession, you know, which has been measured, this is a photo of the Columbia ice field, you know, which is reported to have decreased by some 60%, you know, over the last half a century. And there are huge food security issues in Alaska, food availability, food storage, thawing of permafrost freezers, and the way that climate change and disruption is disrupting a lot of the basic subsistence living that Alaska Native tribal people are dealing with in these areas. Sea ice lost and the subsequent coastal erosion. And there's some, I was reading this morning that there are over 30 villages on the north coast of Alaska that are actually considered at high risk for being washed away from coastal erosion due to sea ice loss. And a lot of significant changes in subsistence livelihood. So those are some of the things that we have seen, or some of the things that we expect in terms of climate disruption. What we mean by one world and one health is the whole idea that there's a link between human health, animal health, and the environment. And, you know, we can use this as a paradigm through which to look at disease ecology and disease emergence. And one thing that I think is pretty indisputable is that changes in climate will, in fact, lead to changes in the environment, and changes in the environment will lead to changes in ecology, and that these will result ultimately in changes in the incidence and distribution of diseases. So it doesn't necessarily say that we're going to see more disease or less disease, but I think it's very safe to say that we'll see changes in the patterns of disease incidence and distribution, which is a stress to a public health system that's already stretched pretty much to its maximum. Climate, weather, and infectious diseases. Well, some of the basic principles that we're talking about is that climate affects the distribution and abundance of vectors. And what I mean by vectors and vector-borne diseases, when we talk about that, we're talking about a vector being a mosquito or a tick or a flea, or in some cases a rat, but this would be an animal that, and usually an insect or arthropod, that transmits the disease from an animal host or reservoir to a human. It transmits the disease-causing pathogen. And so clearly we expect climate to have an impact on the distribution and abundance of disease vectors. We expect climatic variables such as temperature and rainfall to affect disease transmission efficiency by having an effect on vector pathogen physiology. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it's the whole idea that the pathogen, for example, West Nile virus, that the virus itself replicates much faster at warmer temperatures. So you have more efficient transmission by the mosquito in warmer temperatures and during heat waves. Interaction and survival, climatic perturbations, so these would be things such as severe storms, droughts, and patterns such as INSO, that these affect disease occurrence and can drive disease outbreaks. And then finally, changes in climate will result in changes in the incidence and distribution of these environmentally associated diseases. So what do we mean by environmentally associated diseases? What are these climate-sensitive infectious diseases that we're talking about? And these basically fall into four categories. The first is vector-borne diseases, which I've already said something about. The second are zoonotic diseases. And by a zoonotic disease, what we're talking about is a disease that's harbored in a wild animal usually, though it could also be in a domestic animal. But the disease is harbored in these wild animals, and then a tick or mosquito or flea bites that wild animal and transmits that disease to a human. So the human is not a part of the maintenance cycle of the disease, but we tend to be dead-end hosts for these diseases. And this is what we mean when we talk about a zoonosis. Rabies is a zoonosis, for example. Waterborne diseases are also clearly climate sensitive, and then there are a number of other environmentally sensitive, primarily foodborne and dust-associated diseases. Some of the specific examples of these for vector-borne and zoonotic, these include West Nile virus, Lyme disease, plague, rabies, dengue fever, malaria, and then a number of viral hemorrhagic fevers and what we call orthopox viruses. So these are like monkeypox and diseases like that, which are similar to smallpox, which we don't see anymore, but they're associated with wild animals. Environmentally associated diseases, these would be E. coli 15787, which many of you are probably familiar with, and a number of other diseases. I won't go through the list of these. Valley fever is one that we talk about a lot because it's associated with dust storms and drying in the Southwest. And this is an incomplete list, but I just wanted to give you some examples of the types of diseases and disease agents that we're concerned with. So what are some of the recent observations? And when I say recent observations, I'm talking about disease trends. I want to emphasize that we're not necessarily linking these to climate change, but I think it is very safe to say that they're linked to, or they can be linked to weather patterns. And but as you'll see when I kind of wind down at the end, part of the difficulty for us is that all of these diseases have a number of different risk factors. And And so it's difficult just to say that climate change or in some cases even weather is the cause of these things, because there are frequently a number of different causes. And hopefully by the time I'm finished with this talk, you'll have a greater appreciation for this. But some of the things that we're talking about include the interannual trends in West Nile virus epizootics, which is an outbreak in animals, and epidemics, which are outbreaks in people, changes in the incidence and distribution of Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases, autochthonous, which means local, transmission of dengue fever in southern Florida, which I have listed here because it's a recent observation. But in this case, this is pretty much linked to the disease being introduced by travelers coming in from Latin America and other places where dengue transmission is very common, and arriving in a place where the mosquito that transmits it already exists. So we don't think of dengue in Florida as being caused by climate or even induced or enhanced by climate change at this point. But I have it on this list because it's one of the questions that people frequently have. The northern expansion of eastern equine encephalitis, valley fever, which I mentioned, and Cryptococcus gattii, which is another fungal agent that we've seen in disease outbreaks in the Pacific Northwest. And there's been a lot in the media that probably all of you have seen about is global warming causing such things as the West Nile outbreak in 2012. So there are a lot of questions about this. And in terms of this outbreak, West Nile virus outbreak in Dallas, Texas, this was a headline that there was a state of emergency declared, and they did the first aerial spraying in 46 years. So those of you from the Texas region would certainly, this would still be very fresh on your mind. So just a little about that outbreak, because there has been a lot of talk about this the summer of 2012 and global warming and climate patterns and things like that. There were approximately 5,400 human cases reported across the entire U.S., and these were all reported from the lower 48 states. It was the largest outbreak since 2003, and it was focally intense, with a third of all the reported cases coming from Texas, and 50% of the Texas cases being reported from the 4-county area around Dallas. And the general consensus on this is that while high level of West Nile virus, the high level of West Nile virus activity that we had last summer, or actually I guess the summer of 2012, in this sense, was in fact influenced by a mild winter, an early spring, and a warm summer. And so what happens is that you get the subsequent long growing season together with the hot summer that results in increased mosquito reproductive cycles and accelerated virus replication rates, and this facilitates a greater risk of West Nile virus amplification and then transmission to humans. So that's really all I'll say about West Nile, and I really want to move into Lyme disease as a case study, because I think what we'll do is give you a greater appreciation for the complexities that we see when we try to link weather and climate to infectious diseases. So Lyme disease is caused by a spirochetal bacterium, Borrelia burgdorferi. This is a little corkscrew-shaped bacteria that you see in that little panel at the top of the 4 images on the right side of the slide. It's transmitted by ticks that are in the genus Ixodes, and we call these black-legged ticks or deer ticks. And the reservoirs for the spirochetes include small mammals like the mouse that you see here, white-footed mouse, but also can include chipmunks and squirrels, and in some cases birds. And then the host for the tick is both the small mammals, the immature stages of the tick feed on the small mammals, and then deer and larger mammals are the host for the adult stages of the tick. And so deer are actually required for tick populations to survive over long periods of time. Lyme disease, the symptoms, typical symptoms include fever, headache, fatigue. There's a characteristic skin rash that occurs in about 80% of the cases, and we call this, it's a bullseye-shaped rash, which is what you see in the image on the right. We call this erythema migrans, and if left untreated, infection can spread to the joints, to the heart, and to the nervous system, so it can be a quite serious disease. Fatalities are rare, but they can occur. most common, it's the most common vector-borne disease in the United States. And this slide shows the transmission cycle of Lyme disease. And if you start in the middle of the slide, the eggs hatch in the spring, and the larval stage of the tick emerges in the summer and feeds usually on birds or on small rodents, particularly on the white-footed mice, which are the key reservoirs for the Lyme Borrelia. And then the larva will take a blood meal, it will fall off, it will overwinter, and then actually emerge the following spring as a nymphal stage. And the nymph stage of the tick, it's about the size of a poppy seed, so they're actually very tiny and about the size of a freckle, and so often they'll bite and go unnoticed. And so for this reason, the nymphal stage of the tick is the most important stage from a public health standpoint. And the nymph stages will bite other rodents, but they'll also bite people and larger animals as well. And in some parts of the U.S., you can have 20 to 40% infection rates for Lyme disease in these nymphal tick populations. But they typically emerge in the spring, and the highest risk for Lyme disease transmission is usually from May into July, and this varies by latitude. And this is also largely temperature-driven event, so Lyme disease risk is earlier in the more southern parts of the U.S., and it tends to be later in the season the further north you go. But the nymphal tick will feed, and it will fall off and molt, and then it will emerge later in the summer as an adult. And adults also are very good vectors for Lyme disease, but since they're a little bit larger, they're more likely to be noticed on a person, and so the tick is more likely to be removed before it has time to transmit the disease. So that's kind of the transmission cycle in a nutshell. Lyme disease, the first cases actually were observed fairly recently in the late 1970s in Lyme, Connecticut, hence the name, and it was seen in a cluster of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis patients in cases in children. The agent, as I mentioned, was Borrelia burgdorferi, and it was discovered and described in the early 1980s. There were also earlier reports, once it was described and discovered, there were reports that were linked back to the 1940s and in Long Island, and there were also cases that were seen very early on in the upper Midwest and Wisconsin in particular. So what we see now is that it's one of the most common diseases in the United States. And here at CDC, there are about 60 or 70 reportable diseases. And what we mean by that is that when a physician-diagnosed case occurs, that the physician or healthcare provider is required to report that case to the local health officials, who report it to the state health officials, who report it to us. And so we track disease trends for these reportable diseases across the entire U.S. And so you can see Lyme disease is actually the 7th most commonly reported disease. And it's some studies that we're doing right now have actually determined that it's underreported by an estimated 10-fold. So, you know, there may be as many as 300,000 cases of Lyme disease in the U.S. each year. So it's a very common, very important disease. This is what we've seen in terms of the trends over the last 15 or 20 years. And so we've had this gradual increase. The cases going down in the last 3 years is probably not highly significant. I mean, the disease is emerging, and pretty much every year we're seeing this slow, gradual increase in cases that are reported. This shows a snapshot of the distribution of Lyme disease in the United States. I've left California off the map here. Lyme disease occurs in California. There are, you know, between 100 and 200 cases a year typically reported there. But the real, and that's along the Pacific coast in general, but the bulk of the cases, as you can see, occur in the northeastern part of the United States and in the upper Midwest. And this map shows how the disease has expanded. And you can see that there's been primarily, mostly sort of a northwestward expansion we've seen. In the Midwest, it's pretty much expanded. It's certainly expanding north, but it's expanded south as well. And we've seen that down into Virginia and even into North Carolina. We've seen it spreading south as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit more toward the end of the talk. And it's not just Lyme disease that has been increasing. We've seen the same general pattern with all of the major reportable tick-borne diseases. So we've seen Lyme disease increase. We've also seen Rocky Mountain spotted fever cases increasing, Ehrlichia and Anaplasma, and Babesia, which only became reportable in 2011. But that disease has very much been emerging in the areas of the U.S. where it's most important. There's been a lot of work that's been done on climate change and the vector of Lyme disease and Lyme disease itself. And this is a climate model that was produced by John Brownstein and Derlin Fish and the colleagues at Yale School of Medicine and published in 2005. And it really just shows how using these climate scenarios, which I sort of mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, those projections on how we expect weather, precipitation, and temperature to change over the next 50 to 100 years. If you apply those models to what we know about the current distribution and the ecological drivers for the distribution, you can create a projection of where we expect the tick to emerge and increase over the next 50 years or more. And so you can see this expansion into Canada and greater parts of the central United States. And this is some data from our colleagues in Canada at Public Health Agency of Canada, just to emphasize what they've seen in terms of Lyme disease emergence in Canada. And this is what they have seen, this gradual increase in cases as well, and they're very concerned about Lyme disease emergence in Canada. In fact, next week I'll be at a meeting in Ottawa between CDC and Health Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada and officials from the Ministry of Health in Mexico, where we'll be talking about the prospects for climate change and how that is impacting disease emergence throughout the entire North American continent. Because as you can imagine, the mosquitoes and ticks and these animals are not respecters of political boundaries and borders. So we're all connected by the same land mass. So this map sort of goes back to the maps that I showed a few slides ago, and it really captures the ways we've seen Lyme disease expand. And so while we've seen it expand northward, we've also seen it expand southward, and it kind of causes us a little bit pause to say that, or it would cause us to be very concerned about saying that climate change is causing the expansion of Lyme disease. I think that probably it is very much driving it as it expands northward, but there are clearly other drivers that would be causing the disease to expand southward, and that's not that certainly would not be unusual for a disease like Lyme disease, which is carried by animals and transmitted by ticks. And hopefully I can demonstrate that in the next couple of slides, actually right here. So Lyme disease has been emerging, and this really shows land use patterns. And if you look back to the 1860s, and this is a slide or picture of Middlebury, Vermont, and you can see that it was pretty much 80 or 90% cultivated. And you can look at the same area in the 1900s, and you can see the beginnings of reforestation. And in the 1980s, you can see almost a complete reforestation. And so this is something that's occurred throughout the northeastern United States. if you look at the panels on the left here in 1830 Massachusetts, and the white color encodes open cultivated lands, and the green color indicates forests. And then you can see how much reforestation has occurred from 1830 to 1985. And so if you look at the image on the right side of the slide, what you have here is a wooded area, and then you still see the stone rows where this land was once cultivated many years ago. And farmers would remove the stones and pile them up along property lines, and then and the land in between was you can actually, even today, sometimes even see furrows in the land where it used to be plowed, and it can be completely grown up with forest and trees now. So how has that impacted a disease such as Lyme disease? Well, the view is that Lyme disease has been present in the U.S. For many, many, many years, and certainly way before America was settled. And then in the 1700s, it was largely cultivated. The deer populations were decimated, and as you see in this little graph down in the middle of the bottom middle of the slide, the estimated numbers of deer in Connecticut, the deer were almost non-existent in Connecticut at the turn of the century, and now they're well over 80,000 deer in terms of the population. And at the same time, we've seen a tremendous expansion of suburbia. And so with Lyme disease, it's really more of what we call a reemergence, which has been caused by reforestation, overabundant deer populations, increased numbers of ticks, the expansion of suburbia into wooded areas, and all of this has resulted in increased exposure opportunities. And I think we've gotten a little bit better at diagnosing it and reporting it, but I think the increases are not just due to better surveillance, they are true disease emergence. And but again, just to emphasize that while that this has resulted probably in this expansion in all different directions of the U.S. And again, just to emphasize that we've also seen Lyme disease expanding southward, and this is looking at Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And then the text down at the bottom just talks about even in North Carolina now we're beginning to see what we call autochthonous acquired cases, or that just means we're seeing locally acquired cases of Lyme disease. That is, people are not getting them as a result from traveling, not getting Lyme disease simply as a result from traveling to Lyme endemic areas, but they're acquiring it locally. And so while climate change is very likely to be driving the expansion northward, clearly there are other drivers that are expanding it southward. And this is one of my favorite illustrations. It's from an Institute of Medicine report in 2003, and it's entitled "The Black Box of Disease Emergence," which is what you see in the middle. What is the, how do we peel back the onions, and what is there in the black box, that explains why disease outbreaks occur. And this is called the convergence model, and it shows that at the center of disease outbreak emergence, you have the microbe and you have the human, and then one level out, you have the idea of genetic and biological factors that are impacting both the microbe and the person. You've got ecological factors that are impacting both the microbe and the person, and then you have social, political, and economic factors, and physical, environmental factors, and all of these things that are contributing to the mystery of disease outbreaks and emergence. And so this Institute of Medicine report actually lists 13 different drivers for disease emergence, and climate and weather are one of those, but there are a number of other ones here. And the other important thing to realize is that climate and weather can affect disease emergence at a very proximal way. It can have a direct impact on the microbe and a direct impact on humans, but it can also impact a number of other of these factors through its secondary involvement. For example, if an area becomes very less hospitable for human habitation, then we have what we call climate migration, possibly. And so this could be a way in which climate and weather are actually driving human demographic behaviors, economic development, and even travel. So it's very complicated. And so kind of winding down, where do we need to go with all of this? And from a public health perspective, what we emphasize is the need for an anticipatory framework as opposed to a reactionary framework. But this is a framework that really emphasizes three likelihoods. The first is that a significant increase in the frequency of severe weather-related crises. You know, these 1,000-year precipitation events, I've been told, which is what we had here in Colorado in September when we had the flooding of the Big Thompson and the St. Vrain and South Platte and Poudre River. You know, that these were that we should expect more of these types of things, more severe hurricanes and other events like that. Also, temporal and geographic changes, we should expect these to occur. And in the current distribution of adverse events that require public health preparedness and response. So what we mean by that is that we will start to see probably more of these types of events occurring in places where we've not seen them occur before. And that's likely to stress our public health response system. You know, if funds are not allocated in a particular state to be able to respond to a emergency event that's never occurred there before in the past, but could occur there in the future. And so an anticipatory framework would expect those types of things. And then finally, stress leading to potential failure of government structures and services that are aging and in need of repair. So these are highways, bridges, energy systems, sewage and water delivery systems. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration as we look forward into the future at what a public health response might be to changing disease ecology. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about what are the specific research needs that I think about in my role here at CDC, and others who are in state health departments and universities and at other federal agencies. Such things as long-term surveillance on climate change and the impact on disease ecology and epidemiology. It's easy for us to look at weather, but how do you look at climate? The only way you can look at that really is to have a long-term commitment to study these things and collect information on them in a longitudinal fashion. Secondly, integrated data systems with comparable scales. And what I mean by that is that there are some information collected on temperature and humidity and rainfall. Often this is collected on a moment-by-moment basis, or maybe it's collected on a daily basis, and maybe it's collected you know, at a kilometer scale, or you know, there's remotely sensed data from satellite imagery, and it has different time frames and different geographic scales. Disease information is really collected on an annual basis, though we can get the information on the week of onset. But the temporal scale is actually much less precise, and the geographic scale is even less precise. It's often reported at the county level, and of course, as you probably know, there are counties like San Bernardino County in California that's 20,000 square miles, and which is larger than entire states, such as Rhode Island and Delaware, that are more like 1,200 square miles or 2,000 square miles. So we have great differences in scales, and so to be able to study these things, we need to have systems that are comparable, so that we can look at both temporal and spatial scales of disease emergence, information, and temperature and rainfall and all these things. Models that predict potential impact of long-term climate change and short-term climate disruption, the knowledge of what types of adaptation and mitigation strategies have the greatest potential for success, and are also economically affordable, because that's a huge concern today. And then a better understanding of potential future challenges. And these would be things such as increasing populations of mosquitoes and ticks and fleas, increasing durations of a transmission season, rather than it ending, if it ends with the first frost, if that frost is moved back to later in the season, what impact does that have on disease transmission? And exotic introductions. There's always a risk that agents could be brought in from another part, a more tropical part of the world, and if the weather here and climate is becomes more susceptible, then you could have these agents becoming established here. And then finally, more rapid environmental degradation of pesticides. That's a concern, especially of our colleagues at EPA. And that leads directly into resistance management strategies and options, including greater reliance on what we call integrated pest management approaches, which really don't have time to talk about that a lot now, but that's research. So in conclusion, vector-borne and zoonotic diseases and environmentally associated diseases are significantly impacted by climate and are at the forefront of concern over global emerging diseases. A One Health lens or a paradigm emphasizes a critical relationship between human health, animal health, and the environment in our understanding of what drives disease emergence and outbreaks. Complex weather patterns and global climate change directly impact the ecology of these diseases, and an integrated understanding of these things, climate, ecology, epidemiology, is really critical for predicting and averting future epidemics. We recently have a program that we established with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, NCAR, where postdoctoral fellows can spend a year there at NCAR learning atmospheric sciences and climatology, and then they spend a year at CDC learning disease ecology and epidemiology and developing research projects that allow these two different disciplines to be merged so that we have an integrated understanding of these very different concepts. And then finally, the best preparation to prevent, mitigate, and adapt to emerging disease threats is to continue our investment in surveillance so that we can maintain a really strong national public health system so that when a disease occurs in a new area, it will be detected quickly and reported, and this will allow prevention and control activities to be rapidly and effectively mobilized. So I think with that, I'll stop. These are just a couple of publications that you might be interested in. They can be obtained at the website that you see below, and it's basically cdc.gov, and then you look for the Climate and Health Program at CDC, and these are publications that are listed there.
Ben, we'll put that on our website for folks that they can, on our WxTalk website, they can reference those.
Excellent. Well, that's it. I appreciate it, and if we have some time for questions, I think.
Wow. Well, thank you, Ben. Wow, a lot of challenges await us. It looks like with climate change and disease. A lot of things that we didn't know out there. I mean, this has been very helpful, just enlightening on how climate change can affect these diseases. And for you CoCoRaHS folks out there that are taking rainfall measurements, your rainfall measurements go into look at climate and help these guys as they start to look at change and so forth, and so what you're doing is really important. We've got a couple questions that have come in, and we'll take more. One here just came across was Tom from Boulder here in Colorado wanted to know, do you think the mosquito population in the flood zone would have exploded if the Colorado floods had occurred in early June this year? What do you think about that, Ben?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. It's likely that they would have increased. You know, there are just a lot of other variables that are involved in that. It's interesting that we always deploy people in the aftermath of hurricanes, and yet it's kind of maybe it's because prevention is doing a really good job, but we've not seen a lot of mosquito-borne diseases associated with the hurricanes in the aftermath of the hurricanes on the on the Gulf Coast. So I don't know. It's quite possible. The other thing to remember, though, is that the mosquitoes that transmit these different diseases have different habitats. Some are what we call floodwater mosquitoes. Others are more permanent pool mosquitoes. And West Nile virus mosquitoes here in Colorado are typically Culex tarsalis, and these are common in waterways, irrigation ditches, and more pools like that, and they're less likely to be associated with floodwaters. But it's a good question, and it's hard to say. Sorry, I can't give you a more authoritative answer on that, but it's a good question.
Okay, here's another one. Ruta in Maine wants to know if you mentioned you're working with Canada. Are you also working with the UN, the World Health Organization, or other international groups?
Yes, we are, and there is one group in particular called GEO, which is a group on Earth observations, and GEO is an international organization which has membership primarily from all the different organizations that are agencies, federal agencies around the world that are doing remotely sensed type of studies. So they are like NASA, they're flying satellites and collecting data. Be NASA and their other counterparts in other countries, and then there are a lot of other agencies. For example, I'm participating in that at CDC, folks from NOAA and U.S. Geological Survey and USDA, and quite a number of federal agencies are part of this international effort. And then, of course, with the World Health Organization and the counterpart of that with weather, there's a lot of talk about working together globally on climate change and what impact that's expected to have. And I mentioned the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This again is an international international organization, and so there are writers on the AR5 report who are employees here at CDC. I was a reviewer for the health chapter. So there's a lot of crosstalk that occurs, and a lot of this work is done kind of as an unfunded mandate, even, to try to work together and be proactive about this and talk about it together across international boundaries.
Okay, here's a question from James. Wants to know, at the present time, is infection with N-Fowleri, can't even read it, Fowleri, limited to fresh waters in southern states?
Yeah, well, that's a good question to do, and that's Naegleria fowleri, and that's an amoeba that causes what we call primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, and that was I didn't mention that per se, but it was listed on the slide that I showed on environmentally sensitive diseases, and it's a free-living amoeba that's typically found in the bottoms of warm, shallow lakes in the southern part of the U.S., but in recent years we've seen cases as far north as Minnesota, so which was quite a surprise. This occurred 2 summers ago, I think, and there have also been cases on the East Coast, Carolinas, Virginia, and which is one of those diseases we've had our eye on in terms of trying to understand, is this due to a warming climate, warming waters, and how is that likely to spread, or is it likely to spread as we see this impact of global warming? And so all I can say right now is that it's found in warm freshwater lakes, primarily shallow lakes and ponds is where we typically see it, and there has been a movement northward of these cases, and it is quite possible that that it could be impacted by climate change.
Jim had another part to his question. He wanted to know if there was any work being done on newer, more effective insect repellents. Yeah,
there's actually a whole lot of work that's going on that. I can talk really about one that we're doing here at CDC. We recently have a product that we identified called Nucotone, which is actually a sesquiterpene. That's a group of chemicals that come from the Alaskan yellow cedar tree, and they're also found in citrus peel. And this compound actually has been shown to be very effective both in repelling and killing ticks and mosquitoes. And so we have a couple of licensing agreements that we've recently signed with two different companies to try to develop these. One would be developed as one company would develop this in soft soaps and lotions. So you could rub a lotion on your body, and it would be a repellent for ticks before you go out and hike. Or you could come back home after you've been outdoors, and you could shower off with a soft soap that has this Nucotone compound in it. And the nice thing about Nucotone is a natural product chemical, and it's considered food grade, meaning that it's non-toxic. And so I know that a lot of people have aversions to synthetic pesticides and synthetic repellents, and so we're hoping that this will can be developed and marketed and will be something that consumers are very interested in. And there are others. We're not the only ones working on these. That's just one that comes to mind. So the short answer is yes, there's a lot of work going on in this area.
Ben Calvin wants to know, are there other things that we can do to protect ourselves from mosquitoes, ticks, and so forth if we're active in the outdoors?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad someone asked it, because it would be shame on me to give a talk on this and not end on a primary prevention message. And so that's something we really emphasize here at CDC. So what we always say is that that to protect yourself from the ticks that transmit Lyme disease is to wear repellents, to check yourself for ticks after you've been outdoors. So when you come back in, you do a tick check. To shower, there's research that's been shown that showering, within an hour or two of having been outdoors in tick-infested areas, that can wash unembedded ticks from your body. And then to report any fever or rash or flu-like illness associated with tick bite to your physician, because early and accurate diagnosis and treatment is really critical to what we call secondary prevention, which is recognizing and treating it before it becomes very serious. And for mosquitoes, certainly using repellents, DEET-based repellents are one of the best things that we have going right now, and that's usually in a concentration of 20 to 30% active ingredient. You don't need 80 or 90 or 100%. I'm an active fly fisherman, and I sprayed some 100% some DEET on myself when I was fly fishing early in the summer. It got on my waders, and it started burning the waders, and so I was imagining what kind of impact it might have on my skin. But so you really don't need that concentrated form. 20 to 30% is very useful. There's another compound called permethrin, and this is really excellent, especially for tick protection. That you can buy permethrin impregnated clothes, socks and trousers and shirts, and these are very effective. You can also spray it on your clothing. It's not recommended for use directly on the skin, though. And so those are all products and methods that we highly recommend. And on our website, you can find all of this information. It's www.cdc.gov, and then you can look for these diseases. They're listed in alphabetical order and by alphabetical listing at the top of the page. And so we have a lot of information on prevention there.
Yeah, Ben, I was amazed. I found a deer tick. I was on Long Island a couple of years ago in the fall. I had a jacket on, I had long pants, and a hat, and the next morning I was showering and found one on my hip. So even when you're bundled up, they seem to can make their way. It's pretty surprising.
And that really emphasizes why it's important to do tick checks. And so we really encourage people to inspect themselves closely, and even cracks and crevices and creases, because ticks are not respecters of privacy, if you know what I mean.
Here's a question from John, and he wants to know that he says TB and malaria are among the top 3 infectious diseases worldwide. What influence will climate change have on these diseases for the U.S., and what can be done before it becomes a problem here?
Yeah, so let me talk about malaria first. And there's a lot of work that's been going on malaria and climate change. And I think the areas where we expect climate change to have a greater impact on malaria will be areas in the tropics where in the developing countries in particular that don't have strong public health programs. And I guess what I would emphasize is that malaria here was present in the southern United States for many years. And in fact, my first job I ever had in this field was with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And as those of you who know about TVA, it was formed back in the 40s. And what happened, they built dams and to generate hydroelectric energy. And as they built these dams, they backed up waterways, and it actually exacerbated the malaria problem, which was already there in the United States. And so TVA launched this whole program on vector control. And so I started working with them right out of high school and worked for 4 or 5 years in that area. And so TVA did a lot of things like draining swamps and raising and lowering water levels through the dams and spillways. And so all that to say, here in the United States, we don't really have malaria that occurs local transmission to any great degree because of the public health standards that we have. People have screens on their doors. We've got access to care, medical care, and then we do these other types of interventions, vector controls. And so I wouldn't say that there's a great risk for malaria reintroduction into the U.S. due to climate change. I think where it's a greater risk is where you have more temperate areas in the developing world and lower public health standards and capacity to prevent and control the disease. And so I do think that it will be a bigger problem, but I don't think it will. I would just say the burden of this will be borne on those who can least bear it, unfortunately. So it is something we need to be concerned about from a global community perspective. TB, now I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, TB is, you know, there are a lot of environmental concerns about TB. I mean, as you probably know, indoor cooking stoves and things like that have probably increased the susceptibility of people living in the developing country to TB because of the impact it has on poor air quality and lung condition and their susceptibility to other illnesses. I don't really know. It's not an area that I work with, and so I'd be afraid to conjecture beyond that on what we expect to see for TB, other than I'd just say that TB is in many ways an opportunistic infection. You can have primary infections with TB, but it's usually something that's seen much worse in patients who are aging and those who have other disease conditions, such as HIV, for example. So yeah, that's it's a good question. Sorry I can't say more about that.
Thanks, Ben. Actually, I've got one here. Richard, and Richard's a retired federal supervisor with the TVA, he says, from Tennessee. He says, hello. Ask if you could put that slide back up showing the CDC link. And we'll have that on our website later on. But if you can go back to that link, and that'll be on your screen.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the map because the, let's see, it's got the link that's more to the, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to project it. I think I can do this.
Okay.
Bear with me just a minute here.
And we've got time for more questions. We're getting near the top of the hour, but we've got at least 15 or 20 minutes, if that works for you, Ben, to answer some more of these questions. Are
you seeing CDC's webpage now?
Got it right in front of us, yeah.
Okay, so it's just www.cdc.gov. And if you look at this A to Z index there, L for Lyme disease, go down to the alphabetical listing, and you'll see Lyme disease. And this is our web page, and so you can see prevention, and you can see we were talking about prevention on people, and the things I mentioned: bathe and shower as soon as you've been out of doors, conduct a full body check, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to, we also have a page just for tick-borne diseases. So if you go to ticks, then this is our page on tick-borne diseases, and so you can look here. It tells about preventing it in your yards, other information, all the other tick-borne diseases that are concerned to us. And then if you want to look at the other diseases, such as West Nile virus, again, you just go and click on the alphabetical listing, and so you can see the information on West Nile virus. And there's links here to all the other mosquito-borne viruses.
Wow, this is great. This is really good. And folks, again, it's www.cdc.gov. That's all you need to get there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I've got another question for you. Actually, I've got one I wanted to ask you. Climate change, the dust, so valley fever, as we deal with drought in different parts of the country. Is this just a disease that you find in California, or can valley fever spread as dust blows across the country? What would the effect be there?
Yeah, and since I'm here clicking over slides, I was going to go back to the slide on reportable diseases. It's really interesting. You look at this slide. Valley fever, which is the scientific name for that, is coccidioidomycosis, which is a real mouthful, but it only became reportable in 2011. So the first case numbers popped up in 2012, and it was the 8th most common reportable disease in the U.S., the first year it became reportable. And you know, this is not my area of expertise, so I have to give you that disclaimer from the beginning. There are other people here at CDC that spend their entire work life working on this disease, and they know way more about this than I do. But the bulk of the cases, as I understand it, come from the Southwest, from Arizona area, and from Southern California, and these are associated with dust storms, the big dust storms that we've had, and soil and drought. And so the projections of whether or not that, how that's going to expand with climate change is hard to say. But if you do see, and the climate models actually, you know, project the Southwest desert expanding here in the Colorado and the Four Corners area, so you could think that if the desert expanded more toward our area in Denver and places like that that are that got large population centers, that you could have increasing numbers of people that are exposed to it. But I don't think you have to worry about these dust-borne agents blowing all the way across the U.S. I think it's something that's probably that's pretty local in terms of the risk for that.
Okay, William writes, and he wants to know, could you please give an example of how weather or climate has affected an environmentally associated disease such as caused by E. coli?
Yeah, I'll say such as E. coli. I think that what I would do really is go back to this illustration that I mentioned on West Nile early on, and I think that probably this is a pretty good. I think it's a pretty good case study in the way that weather patterns could, the weather could impact infectious disease. And so, you know, in 2012, there was a very mild winter and a very early spring and a very warm summer. And so what that does is you've got mosquito populations that are getting started earlier in the year, you know, because of the milder winter and early spring, so you have more cycles of mosquitoes that are reproducing, and then and those build up over time. And then you also, the warmer summer means that in these warm areas, when a mosquito becomes infected, the virus replicates faster inside the mosquito. And so that actually increases the mosquito's capacity to transmit the disease agent. And so those two things kind of work together, and so you have this longer transmission season, longer time for disease amplification, because what happens is you've got amplification occurring between birds and mosquitoes, and that goes, and it's going round and round and round. You get more infected mosquitoes, and then later in the year, the birds are migrating, the mosquitoes are still there, you've got larger numbers of infected mosquitoes, and that's why we typically see the human cases of West Nile occurring more in August and September. And here in Fort Collins in 2003, we had a really big West Nile year, and that was the year that I actually moved here from CDC Atlanta. And I remember in the end of July walking our dogs around the block, and I saw 3 or 4 dead corvids. These are crows and jays and magpies and things like that. And that was a real harbinger for the outbreak that was to come, because I don't think at that time we really had such a connection between bird die-offs and infections in mosquitoes and risk to humans. So this is kind of a way that a weather pattern or trend impacts disease outbreaks. And I think with E. coli, it's a little bit harder to draw those types of connections, but we would assume that with E. coli, it's because it is associated with fecal contamination of water and things like that. And obviously the bacteria are going to replicate at faster rates and warmer temperatures. So, it's complicated. There are a lot of variables. And that's kind of what we say about all these things. It's complicated, and there are a lot of variables. And but sort of the conventional wisdom is that why it certainly has got to have an impact, and we need to study these things more carefully.
Thanks, Ben. I just got a question from our director here, Nolan Duskin, and he spends his summers up in Michigan, up in the Mackinac area, and he was wondering, is Michigan really resistant to Lyme disease? And if so, why? Or is that mostly an issue of difference in reporting to the CDC? I guess looking at your maps earlier, he was wondering if there's any resistance up there.
And I'm not sure exactly what you mean by resistance, but I think that what we have seen Lyme disease emerge in Michigan. There have been increasing numbers of cases, and we've got some very good collaborators at the Michigan State and in the Michigan Department of Health. And what I would show is just going to this web page that you can probably see here. This is in our statistics and disease surveillance part of our website, but you can look at 2001 and you can see how the disease was associated, and you can look up at 2011. And so the trend in Michigan, you can clearly see there are more cases than there previously were there. Not a whole lot of cases, but it is very much emerging there, but it's not a hot spot like it is in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And, I don't really know enough about the ecology there in terms of deer populations and the reservoirs, the white-footed mouse and tick populations. But it's, it's there. It's just not one of the hottest parts of the country, but it's certainly a concern there.
Okay, thanks. Mary writes in, and she says, oftentimes we see organisms adapt to efforts to control them. Have you seen these types of changes with Lyme, malaria, and West Nile?
I can't think of any examples, but that's really true. I mean, we have all of these types of things that we say, nature abhors the vacuum, and that there's this tit for tat type of thing that goes on. But I can't right off think of a specific way in which a disease agent or vector has adapted to a situation like this, kind of in a coevolutionary type scheme. I have to think about that.
Okay, here's one. Chris from Berry College in Rome, Georgia, says to say hello, and they were wondering what directions for future research is the federal government expressing interest in supporting as far as development of models for monitoring impact on climate change, on infectious disease vectors? What are you hearing out there?
Well, you know, it's hard to comment on federal budgets. We all know the situation that we're in right now with the economy the way it is. And I can say this, that the CDC Climate and Health Program is actually in CDC's National Center for Environmental Health. I'm located in CDC's National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases. And, but the Climate and Health Program in what we call NCEZID, Environmental Health, does give out funding to support a program they call their Climate Ready Cities and States initiatives. And so they give money both to state and local health departments, and they also give some grants out to university researchers to look at some of these issues. And most of that work is really more toward climate climate readiness. So it's surveillance, it's dealing with severe events such as urban heat islands and heat stroke and ways of predicting and mitigating those types of issues when they occur. So before they occur and adapting to them when they do occur. So I guess the short answer to Chris's question is that I don't anticipate us having funds that we would be able to give out or you know, in support of infectious disease work with climate change right now, and that doesn't mean that it wouldn't occur in future years. But it's complicated.
Okay, well, thanks. Here's one from Christine, and she has noticed that over time, when she was younger, that she would get allergies. But this is kind of a long question here. I guess that the nights being warmer now, have you found that? And I don't know if you know much about allergies would be part of this. Probably more of a different field, but she's wondering about the warm nights, if that has any influence on the flowers, I guess, producing more pollen and so forth.
Yeah, you know, there are people who are looking at particulate matter and air quality and the impact of climate change on that. There's a lot of concerns about, you know, weed production and the allergens that are associated with ragweed and other types of things like that. And of course, you know, living, you know, I've lived here in Colorado for 10 years, and before that I was in Georgia for 12 years, and it was CDC, and you know, both places we see tons of pollen in the springs, and there's a lot of work, you know, that other people are doing on the impact of climate change on vegetation, especially on allergenic weeds and things like that. But that's outside of my area of expertise, so I really can't comment on that further.
Okay. Well, Ben, thank you for taking the time today to be with us. We really appreciated this presentation. A lot of good stuff here to learn. It's a great website. And again, it's interesting to see how climate can affect these different diseases and the spread of them. So I really appreciate that. We will have your presentation. If you can send us the slides, we'll put that up. We also have recorded today's webinar for if you have friends and family out there that would like to listen to it. That'll be available later this week. And again, thank you so much for being part of our webinar today. So thanks again.
Thank you.